Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good morning or good afternoon to everybody where I am. It's the sun is just waking up. My name is Win Schwartzow. I've been a security guy, is like the way I like to phrase it, for since 1983. And over the next little few minutes, I'm going to talk about something that has been very dear to my heart, which is the concept of how do you actually measure security. And in order to kind of give you the understanding of how I arrived there, I'm also going to give you a little bit of background about me and the way that I think a little bit differently. Currently, we know security isn't working. The fundamental methodology by which we are using security today through permissions and ACLs is using a model that was developed by Anderson in 1972. We are still fundamentally using that same model that many of you may know as called the reference monitor. So to keep in mind that this security model was developed when there were single processor mainframes locked behind doors, guards and dogs in big buildings with lots of physical security. And then along came personal computers, then along came networks, and the model doesn't work. Next generation security technology, we hear from vendors, the next one will do it, the next one will do it, the next one will fix everything. Yet, what are we in? We're in the same mess we have been in for all of these years. There are more breaches. There are more phishing attacks. There are more APTs. There's just more and more and more of it. It's getting worse. And what we're going to discuss today is an entirely different approach to security, that at the end of which you'll be able to go back to your organization and actually try a couple of these things to see how they work for you. My background was analog engineering, not digital engineering. Digital fundamentally didn't exist when I grew up. My mother was a mastering engineer. She cut records, old vinyl LPs at NBC during the war. My father worked on radar development. And so I grew up with a very different view of the universe. My parents gave me a non-optional electrical engineering education starting when I was about 5 years old. I like to say this is my first DEF CON, but when I was this age, I actually started playing around with electronics. And by the age of 5 and 6, I knew how to fix a television. It's not magic, it's not hard, but for a little kid back in those days, it was magic to people. And I would make 50 cents for every television I would repair. We also had an analog recording studio at home. So I was constantly exposed to this thinking called analog, analog, analog. Again, we had no digital. When we wanted to build something, we couldn't go to Amazon. This is the shop around the corner from me. When I grew up, that we'd have to go in and find the parts and build things by hand, a very different way of doing things. This was my first computer, and it was an analog computer that actually emulated the operation of a slide rule. And it was very, very cool to have when you're a 9-year-old kid. I ultimately ended up, when I was 16 years old, in the family business in recording studios. And you'll see here a lot of systems. And what happened with my parents teaching me electronics so young is that I had this natural affinity, this natural understanding of complex systems. So we look at that, and what does that patch bay do? What do all the knobs do? What does all of that stuff do? I understood it naturally as an analog engineer, since I'd already spent many years working on it. So then there are what my mother did. Later on, there were advanced versions of analog mechanical electronic systems to cut records. And this was an exceedingly complex system that we had to tune and keep balanced and keep working all of the time. And things would go wrong in the analog realm. On the right is Robert Moog's first synthesizer. And this was a complex system to make sine waves and synthesizer sounds. And this one was based down at Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland Studios in New York. And again, complex systems that were all analog. So we looked at things without any digital view for the universe at all, because that was still yet to come. When we did live TV or we did movies, we had to be able to make sure that the voice and the video, the picture that you saw on the TV or in the movie, was in sync, that the lips or the hi-hats or the musicians, that everything was in sync. And sometimes things broke. That was just the nature of the beast. Sometimes things broke, and we would have to manually adjust the rotation speed of the motors of all of the equipment so that we could keep that pattern up there on the left, which was what we called a stable Lissajous pattern, which meant that the motors were all running at the same speed and in sync. It would work for about 30 seconds. The nature of the analog medium would mean we would fall out of sync again, and we would have to go back, reset, restart, and do it all over again in small 30-second chunks, and then build an entire TV show from there. It was a lot of work, but it was all that we had at the time. So after leaving that career, I decided I'm going to go become a security expert. And I had no degree, no certification, no credentials. I had a lot of analog engineering behind me. And the only thing that existed in 1983 was on the right. We called it the Orange Book, and it was a set of guidelines, specifications almost. Here are some of the ways to go about securing a computer. Now, keep in mind, no networks, virtually no PCs of any meaningful number. And this was about mainframes and mini computers, DECs and IBMs and UNIVAC machines used for the military and Department of Defense and some government applications. And that was the only thing that existed in those particular days. So in the early days of this, we were all learning. And then I had this idea. What happens if we weaponize computers? What happens if we weaponize the internet, such as the internet was back in those days? What if we weaponize viruses? What if we weaponize Van Eck radiation, Tempest attacks? So I wrote a novel on the left called Terminal Compromise that became PearlHarbor.com, which finally became Die Hard 4. And then I wrote a nonfiction book, which ultimately was banned in England for a while because, unbeknownst to me, the majority of it was classified information, and I had no idea because I was kind of just thinking on my own. So this was the very, very early days, even before the web came around. We had sort of, kind of an internet. We had connectivity, but it was not the web as we saw it. So I was looking at things very differently from an analog view back then. Then I testified before Congress, and the term electronic Pearl Harbor is what came up. And then I did a lot of work over with the UK. And this was the basis of my desire to fix the internet, to fix what is wrong. Security cannot be as hard as all of that. It cannot be difficult because, again, I grew up in an analog world where we had answers, we had solutions. I grew up as an engineer, and engineers found answers to questions. So I began pursuing that over the years. And I worked on a lot of books and a lot of projects inside the government. And the book that really kind of triggered a lot of this thinking is called Time-Based Security. And Time-Based Security began, and it's available for free, by the way, on my website, winschwartau.com. It's just a PDF you can download. It was the first set of formulas of how to look at security differently than other people had over the years. So is proving security impossible? I maintain no, that we think we have found an answer on how to do this, and this is what we're going to be sharing. So, a few things to keep in mind though. Digital does not mean binary. Very different things. Binary conditions do not exist very often. There's some degree of fuzziness or analogness everywhere, and we all know that security is never going to be perfect at all. The Maginot lines are what we're using right now of fortress mentality. Let's put up a wall and keep the bad guys out. And we know this does not work. We're absolutely sure it doesn't. Otherwise, we would not be in the mess that we're in right now. So the goal was, how do we analogize? How do we convert this binary mindset into an analog set of conditions to be able to measure security? Well, we have to do a few things when we build a model. And the first thing we have to do is get rid of zeros and ones. There is no such thing as perfect security. There is no such thing as a zero. Think of your volume control that's on your hi-fi, your music at home, or on your phone, or in your car. When you turn it all the way up, that is the maximum. It's not infinity. It is not one. It is the maximum allowed by the controls that are built into that system. When you go down to zero and you cannot hear the music anymore, there is still a little bit of music, a very, very tiny bit of it that's going through that is quieter than your ear's ability to hear it. So it's never on fully, it's never off fully, it's always somewhere in between. I mentioned feedback. We're going to get into why feedback and out-of-band communications is required. But the ultimate thing that you're going to have to wrap your head around a little is the concept of negative time. The entire model that we're going to be talking about does not change any existing infrastructural designs or architectures. TCP/IP, any protocol you're currently using does not change. The third thing that you need to keep in mind here is that because this is an abstract philosophical approach, it works in the cyber domain, it works in the physical domain, and it also works in the human domain, where we see so many security problems today. So we're going to start with the basis of time-based security. And we're going to take a model. We're going to imagine a store. And this store has a lot of jewelry or expensive items in the window. It can be any kind of store. And that store has a plate glass window to ostensibly protect the jewelry, protect the valuables in the window. How long does that in time? How much time does that plate glass window protect the bad guys from stealing that stuff? Well, how big is your rock? How thick is the glass? Maybe you've got some stronger glass, some plate glass that is reinforced. All sorts of possibilities, but ultimately, let's put that on the side. But what we do know is, how long does it take when that plate glass window is broken to trigger an alarm? And it's going to be pretty darn quick. It's going to be maybe a few milliseconds, maybe 1 second, just to make it easy to think about. At that point, what happens? Well, an alarm system then will trigger a reaction. So we have a detection mechanism saying something just happened to my plate glass window. We have a reaction saying maybe it's going to call the cops. Maybe it sets off a high-pitched alarm and calls the cops. There is some reaction in a properly designed system. So what we know is that our detection time and our reaction time is going to equal what is known as exposure time. So this window detects that it's been broken into. The reaction creates an alarm, number one. Number two, maybe it calls the cops. But part of reaction is also the remediation. So how long does it take the cops to get there? Every movie, every TV show you've ever seen that has bad guys robbing things, there's always somebody counting the amount of time. We're in 10 seconds. We have 1 minute left. We have 30 seconds left. And that is because they have done surveillance and measured ahead of time. The goal of the defender is to make the detection and reaction time approach zero. It never will be zero, but approach zero. Get as close as possible. What does this do? This minimizes the amount of time that the bad guys have in the jewelry store example from putting their hands in and stealing stuff, or in cyber world from how much data can be extricated. What is the maximum amount of exposure in time that allows your detection and reaction systems to finally lock down a detected attack? These are the fundamental formulas that we're going to be working with. Now, notice down at the bottom that we also have data loss risk measured as a function of time. Data, hard stored data, can be measured in time. However, the time value that is associated with data in any database whatsoever becomes a function of the bandwidth of the system itself. And this is where data exfiltration and other types of security concerns become very, very important, especially in a privacy-driven world where we have to meet GDPR and all the other standards. Every single element of security does have a time component, which allows us then to talk to risk people. We can talk to finance people, and we're going to see how all of this ultimately works. The first concept is we have to deal with feedback. In the middle of those brass balls, that is called a governor, and it was invented over 200 years ago to keep steam engines from getting out of control. In the lower right, we've got feedback from a speaker system, a microphone, amplifier, and speaker, and we've all heard squeals at concerts or at events when there is too much signal in the feedback loop. And in the upper right, that is the abstract model for feedback. Keep in mind that every single engineering product service ever built in the history of mankind uses feedback except network security. Every single human process involves feedback. Every single societal product uses feedback. Every single portion of learning uses feedback, yet we do not use it or model it in network security. What that means is we are approaching infinity. There are no control clamps, and there is no mathematical model by which to say, I need to do X amount of feedback reduction and control in order to reduce the amount of damage to my systems. This is fundamental engineering 101 that has never been properly applied from a modeling standpoint in network security. In SCADA systems or ICS systems, very large physical critical infrastructures, they all use PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and they all use analog controls. They all use how much more water do I need to raise the level to keep it safe? How much do I need to drain it in order to keep a city from flooding? This is used in every single system. It's used in automatic systems for trains, transportation, for engines, for absolutely everything, whether it involves humans, involves physical, involves cyber, or involves all three. We live in a feedback-based world with all of these things, our lives, our homes, every single thing that we interact with the exception of our computers and cyber world, uses SCADA-like negative feedback, and negative feedback is what keeps things from getting out of control. And when things start getting out of control, they become chaotic and they become non-measurable. And this is where we are today. Now, we have to keep in mind that the brain is a neural network. And at the same time, we have to understand that part of the feedback network of the brain or the body or anything that's built in nature involves continuously varying conditions. Networks involve continuously varying conditions, numbers of users, who is moving data where, who is connected with special VPNs from one partner to another. The nature of a network is exceedingly complex, and every single one of those inputs that you see over on the left, and with the weight updating in the algorithm in the middle, none of them are zeros, none of them are ones. They are all somewhere in between to give an output that is called probabilistic. What is the likelihood of a particular thing occurring? What is the likelihood of a particular brain cell, a neuron, making a decision to turn left or turn right? This is all done with analog weighting. And we're going to introduce more weighting into our model as we move this forward. So where is our network feedback? This is the way that we architect systems. Let's move things around, and we use static controls, ACLs of some sort throughout. Now we have to keep in mind, after that, network security is a bear, and this goes back to a very simple joke. There's two guys out in the woods, and along comes a bear and sees them and decides it may want to eat these guys. So one guy starts running, and the other guy sits down, opens his backpack, and puts on a pair of really great sports sneakers, trainers. And the first guy says, "What are you doing? You got to run from the bear. You got to outrun the bear." And the guy with the sneakers says, "No, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." And this is the core of analog network security. It's about feedback-based time mechanisms where the bear is the adversary and the guys that are running are potential defenders. And we like to call that low-hanging fruit. So the concept of OODA loop feedback was developed in order to have survivability in aerial dogfight combat. Very simple concept, which is number one, observe, and that's detection. Look at your environment. What are the conditions? The next is the orientation or contextualization of it. How does that, or that observation of how I see my environment, how does it fit into other known conditions? How do I weight it with other inputs into my analog neural network? Then I make a decision. Finally, act on that decision. So orient, decide, and act are the reaction, and then I do it all over again. This is how companies become successful marketing products, and the new version of laundry detergent, the new version of the car. They OODA loop their entire process. Business processes are OODA loops. Just-in-time manufacturing are OODA loops, but we don't use it in security. When you get into more complex systems, you end up with a different layers of orientation. In this case, the feedback is going to come from many different points, and we can end up with a fairly complex OODA loop mechanism. This is something that's fairly simple from a guidance system and a combat viewpoint that John Boyd did back in the 1980s. Again, we don't use any of this in our world. For positive feedback, it's exactly the same thing with a slightly different mathematical formula, but that's how we train the brain. That's how we're getting brain-machine interfaces done, by positive feedback and training. That's what education is. Positive feedback. Yes, that's the right answer. That's good. Here's a piece of candy. Move on. This is how we train dogs or animals. Positive feedback. Where do we use positive feedback in our worlds? Unfortunately, we still don't. Now, here's an example of an application of time-based mechanisms. And in this case, it's from a mobile banking app that I use, and it may be with some of yours. So I'll want to initiate a process, and that'll be, I'm going to move some money from one place to another. And I log in, and I ask the app, I want to do this. And the app says, I want to make sure this is you. Or I may be on a strange device. It may not recognize the MAC address. So what happens? That process, that request that I want to do for transfer stops. There's a delay, and it says, go check in maybe your mobile phone, maybe your email. Take a look and look for the code. We're going to use this, and you see OOB, out of band messaging on a separate known channel. Whether it is secure or not doesn't matter at this point, but it's an out of band known channel that when I set up my banking relationship was verified. If I enter in the code correctly, the transfer will occur. If I enter it wrong or I exceed the amount of time that I am allowed by policy with that delay, then that entire process is canceled. There are very few examples of us using this feedback-based out-of-band communication, and in some cases we call it 2FA, and we're starting to see more of that occur, but we're not using it everywhere. Now, my wife's car is very similar, has one of those automatic collision avoidance systems, and so what do? If I'm driving along the highway and I want to turn lanes, I turn on the turn signal, and the car says, oh, no beeping, it's all good, you can turn, move into the lane. The question is, do I move into that lane just based upon what the car says? The car says it's safe. Is it safe? Well, I've been driving a long time, and I say no. I want to have a two-factor authentication based upon time. So I'm going to turn my head either left or right and look, is there a Porsche coming down at me at 140 miles an hour in an adjacent lane that the car doesn't know is there? So I want an additional level of verification that it is safe to change lanes. The amount of time that takes is part of the human's ability to be able to look at a car, how fast it's moving, compare it to how fast you're moving in your vehicle, and make a decision. And we do that as humans exceedingly well. Exceedingly well. We average things very, very well. Do we want to hand over this kind of trust to a car at this point? And that's why we're seeing some issues with autonomous cars, that they are making some poor decisions based upon poor feedback. So part of this analog concept is about trust. Trust is not binary. When somebody goes to work for your company, are they automatically 100%, absolutely, totally, at all times trusted employees? The answer is no. How much do you trust them? And this is where weighting factors have to get in order to be able to establish how much trust I have in an individual, in this case, when one organization, a bank, connects to another bank in order to be able to have a trusted relationship. How long is that trusted relationship good for? One clock cycle, one transaction, 1 minute, 1 hour, 3 years, without continual re-verification of the initial trust conditions that establish that connection in the first place. We as an industry are really very bad about this. And this is, in the lower left, a simple representation of an analog-based OODA loop based upon trust. And trust is going to continuously change and has to be revetted continuously. So the fundamental way we do this is by adapting a new truth table, taking fundamentals of Boolean logic, and we're going to take a process. Analysis is that process. Analysis can be a human, it can be code, it could be a physical door, it could be an ICS system. Doesn't matter. It's a decision process. And we go into an RS flip-flop, and an RS flip-flop is nothing more than a single bit of memory done with various types of logic gates based upon work done in the 1820s to 1840s. So when Alice says, I want to do something, the output enables it. And in most conditions, the way we treat it today is, okay, Alice made a decision, cool, let's just let that, we're done. In analog network security, we're saying, no, that's not secure enough, because how much do we trust Alice? Under the binary condition, it means we must trust her 100% at all times, independent of any external verification. So what we want to do is trigger some time-based event in the feedback loop to say, hey, wait a minute, Alice is making a decision, but Bob really needs to verify it. How long do we want to allow Bob to verify it? Well, if we're dealing with code, it might be a few clock cycles or a few microseconds. If we're dealing with the addition of a new employee into an Active Directory database, it might be an hour, it might be 24 hours. That's all going to be policy driven. The key here is introducing the time-based logic tables to be able to actually measure the amount of time it takes to make a decision and enforce it using policy. Now, part of this is saying, I want to replace defense in depth, which we know doesn't work. More high walls do not work, with the concept of detection in depth. This engine is how we fly in our 777s and 87s, a big GE engine. Inside of that, there are 5,000 detection points looking for engine and subcomponent level behavior. How is it performing? The reason is it's an emulation of neural networks and the human mind. The human mind basically has one function: sense the environment in order to predict the future. That's all that human beings are good at, nothing else. So in this case, we don't want that engine failing at 35,000 feet. We want to know that one of those sensors is suggesting there might be a micro crack in a piece of metal inside of a fan blade, and after this flight's over, you better go take a closer look at this. This is all time-based detection in depth feedback mechanisms in an analog domain. We do it in the physical world. We don't do it in our world. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So what can you do right now? We have a lot of black boxes in our environments, and those black boxes are supposed to detect bad things, uh, viruses, malware, bad behavior, traffic coming from improper locations, whatever it happens to be. A black box vendor should be able to tell you what is the difference between good traffic and bad traffic. If the vendor cannot do that, he should not be your vendor, because you want to be able to verify how good are those vendors' claims. So what we're doing here is very, very simple. We put the black box on the bench in a laboratory, and we throw a lot of good traffic, known good traffic, into it for a while. And there should be no detections, no false positives. So we get our traffic out. Now we introduce what we know to be bad traffic that we know, according to the vendor, should trigger the black box mechanism to go, hey, I just detected something bad. Great. This is the way it's supposed to work. But what we're adding here is an analog feedback mechanism. And as we introduce the hostile traffic, all we're doing is starting a clock. When the black box detects that bad traffic, all we want it to do is stop the clock. And down there is the simple formula for detection time. This detection time is the first step at measuring your networks right now with your existing implementation, and you can also compare products from different vendors. The same process exists when we add reaction or remediation to it. Remediation is a form of reaction, it's a subcomponent, and you may or may not want to define how that remediation is done. One company may do it one way, another may do it another way. But as you see in the lower left, the formula is the same. All we're trying to do is make those numbers as small as possible. So in this particular case, we have the total formula for exposure time. And right now, you can actually measure this inside of your networks, or measure it on a test bed in the laboratory and find out how good your security really is. And this isn't even adding in trust factor yet, and we're not going to have time to get into all of that here. Now, a lot of folks like to have two detection products, and that's great. But Bayesian probability, I mentioned earlier, security is not a zero condition. It's not a one condition. It's a probabilistic condition, which means that there are statistical odds that are associated with every single security event. So some people say, I want two antivirus things. And they'll take the approach down in the bottom, which says I'm going to have black box A or black box B, whichever one finds the bad thing, that'll be its decision. The problem is when you look at the mathematics behind that, the formulas are there. When you have high trust levels, and I'm using 0.99 as an arbitrary high trust level, when you use two detection products and you compare them in this particular way, your security goes down, provably goes down. However, if I require both black boxes to agree, as I did with the Alice and Bob mechanism earlier on with the RS flip-flop, what ends up happening is the probabilistic increase of the efficacy, the strength of that particular process goes up by a factor of 100. And this is just pure mathematics applying Bayesian concepts to the feedback loops that are built inside the world of time. Now, for data exfiltration, I mentioned earlier that the amount of data exfiltration time is going to be correlated to the bandwidth of the network, the size of the data, but more importantly, the amount of delay that we would put into the SMTP channel. So in this case, we have Alice doing an SMTP request. Now, do you want Alice to be able to reply to everybody in her entire contact list by accident? It's an error, maybe not intentional, with your financials for the next 2 years? Probably not. What we do know is that we have technology that can detect this. We understand this completely. The question is, how long does that particular black box take to detect an SMTP violation of corporate policy? That needs to be measured. Those policies need to be written. They need to be enforced. And all that we do here is when a decision is made for an SMTP initiation, we start a clock, a delay clock, based upon how long we have measured. We know that the SMTP filters actually take to occur. Therefore, we can do the verification out of band within the approved amount of policy time in the feedback loop, which is then Bob's approval, and either we let the traffic go through or not. The beauty of this is that because it's SMTP, the user will never see any delays. Whether it's 10 milliseconds or 10 seconds, the user will never see it. So there's no violation to their experience. In this case, we're doing it with phishing. User clicks on stupid stuff. Let's create a delay. We understand how to detect phishing attacks. We have black boxes that will do it. Have we measured them? Do we know how long they take? Do we know how effective they are based upon the trust factor? False positive, false negatives. And all of this comes out of the Bayesian probability math I was showing you earlier. We create a delay system. The delay is negative time. Once that analysis is made, whether it's a lookup or a sandbox, but it's a reaction-based mitigation after the detection is made. The math is simple, the math is there, and it is provable. Now, we can take the same concept and let's say, let's go solve DOS. We're sick of being DOS. So we have black box DOS detection, and we have internal some levels, some a little bit of reaction or remediation. However, what we've also got is a TCP/IP channel, which connects both information and the control signals. So you can end up in a lot of trouble. In this particular case, we are under some sort of DOS attack, DDoS, doesn't matter. So the DOS traffic is coming in from the first hop ISP, obviously. The enterprise says, oh, I'm detecting some DOS traffic. This is really bad. I don't like it. So they can do some degree of filtering, but the remediation back to the first ISP there does not exist because it's jammed up depending upon the kind of DOS attack that we're experiencing. So what we want to build is an out-of-band reaction matrix, and you'll see that circle. In the middle, in this case, we have 6 networks in a mesh format, and a mesh format is how networks work 99% of the time. What we're adding is a reaction matrix that does not communicate every single minute with all the data. The only thing that it cares about is security relevant information that each of these servers, each of these enterprises, each of these ISPs, whatever we want to call those, numbers 1 through 6 in here, we only care about the communication between them with security relevant information. So when we want to solve DDoS, what we want to do is obviously know what's good traffic, what's bad traffic. We're doing exactly the same thing we did earlier. It's still a black box. And then add in remediation time, and that gives us the amount of delay that we care about. And this allows the initial communication between the enterprise and the first hop. Now, what we are going to do is add some flip-flops. We're going to add some additional controls in there that are all time-based, because the time element of how long this takes to identify it is absolutely critical. And you want to be able to communicate from the enterprise all the way up to the ISP, because ISPs are good at what? Filtering. They can filter absolutely anything. So in the ideal world, you want to be able to tell your first hop, hey, I'm getting some funky traffic. This is what it looks like. Please stop it. Now, let's take that same logic and apply it further. So the target in the first hop already got their communication. So now we want that first ISP to tell the next ISP, hey, I'm seeing this traffic. My customer's annoyed. I filtered it out, but it's coming from you. So can you please filter it out from your place as well? Now take this concept and take the limited peering relationships that exist across the planet with how ISPs communicate and share traffic loads and balancing. If we applied this particular logic to every single ISP on the planet, what would happen? Two things. Number one, DDoS and DOS would effectively go away. 97% of the hostile traffic the carriers experience would go away. Number two, DOS and spam have the same fundamental characteristics. You want to be able to trace it to the source and stop it. With the out-of-band channel and communication in the reaction matrix, where the ISPs are talking to each other, they can do the filtering and they can also do the backtracking automatically using a reaction matrix in the feedback loop that is completely time-based. The goal is to squeeze the loop, make the time as small as possible in both the detection and the reaction processes. So we call it squeezing the loop, and there's lots of processes. You're going to have subloops, and the subloops are like subroutines inside of programming. It's a little thing that has to occur to become part of the entire process and make it work. Applying the same concept, all we want is time to approach zero. Adding intelligence is making it even more analog. Are we using straight neural nets? Are we using AI? Are we using ML, DL? What are we using? The point is to keep it as analog and as variable as possible and update that data. The more you update it, the higher your trust factor, the higher your trust level, and ultimately the higher the measurable security. What security will look like is that curve on the left. I'm going to begin with some nominal trust factor that's going to be very, very high. It is going to have a decay factor. That decay, there's mathematics that show it can be exponential, it can be linear, it can be logarithmic, depending upon the environment. We have the feedback abstraction that's on the right, and that is why the line then goes straight back up, because I'm doing a revetting, a reconfirmation of the initial conditions, and I have faith for some period of time, whether it's, again, 1 second, 1 hour, 1 week, up to infinity. How often do I want to redo my vetting and verify that the process is doing what it's supposed to do? When we do implement a full OODA loop, we're going to have orders of magnitude, 8, 10, 12 orders of magnitude of accuracy that are required when an organization receives, let's say 1 million emails a day, and then you multiply that out by the organization, by the remote, by the number of devices, by how often in the year. Suddenly, the numbers we are dealing with are extraordinary, and the trust factor will be 7 sigma, 8 sigma, 9 sigma. And what we want to do when we design these systems is set our minimum and maximum based upon time. This is all doable. It's all mathematically sound, and it can be done out of band and never, ever touch or modify your existing TCP/IP structure. Ultimately, what you want to do is go fast. On the left is the way we look at Boyd with the OODA loops and how people survive aerial dogfights. The mathematics is simple to be able to do. When we look at all of the trust factors, when we look at millions of users, when we look at all of the Bayesian probabilities of how this works, the formula for security is on the right. And it all begins with that concept of minimum and maximum conditions that you see there on the left, where the definition of J and S occur. So that is what you can do now. You can actually measure your detection process. You have the tools. It's a few lines of code. Go for it. You can measure your reaction process. You can do it today, which then tells you you can measure your vendor. If you have two detection mechanisms that are supposed to do the same thing, which one operates with the higher degree of trust over what period of time? You can measure that now in a test bed or through places in higher NSS labs to do it. Ask your vendor. Tell me about how your product lives in the time domain. How well does it perform over time? And they're not going to like that question at all. And looking at everything, you have to realize that it is going to be analog. There are no zeros. There are no ones. There are probabilities of how strong your network is defensively versus the offensive from the adversary, and that is all in the time domain that you can actually measure today. And with that, I want to thank you for your kind attention and hand it back to Ardian.
Thank you, Vin, for delivering this very informative presentation. We want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. A PCB certificate in these above-mentioned courses will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now, we have some questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. The first question is, what is the biggest security concern, and how do we make sure that the security spending and expertise is properly allocated to address that risk?
Oh boy. The biggest security risk is the ignorance, arrogance, and apathy on the part of corporate boards and senior management that think it will not happen to them, that think that they actually have security that is strong enough. And with that kind of mindset trickles down throughout the corporation, and suddenly you have people that are not even trying anymore. Security mindset has to come from the top. And if it's not at the top and they don't allocate the right budgets and allow you to hire the right people to do the jobs, and they may not have degrees, they may look funny, they may have tattoos and purple hair, and they may not socialize very well, but it has to be skills-based, absolutely. And that requires a massive transformation at the corporate level, at the board level, and at the C-suite.
Thank you, Vin. Another question is, why haven't the security industry not taken this model of security that you just presented seriously? Because as he sees it, it's a very sound model.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I only published the book 2 months ago, and so I don't expect instant adaptation at all. I've been working on this almost 20 years. Some of the people that have been following the work are saying exactly what you're saying. And the problem is, it's sort of like saying, why didn't somebody invent the wheel before somebody invented the wheel? And that's a tough one. Number two, keep in mind, how long has IPv6 been around? 20 years? And how much adaptation of IPv6 has there been? 20%, 30%? In order for people to take this seriously, what we're trying to do is get some test bed figures. We are talking to universities and research labs to be able to bring in this kind of equipment and start actually doing the measurements. The pressure is going to have to come from the community, people like yourself, on the vendors, because the vendors are the ones that I'm really calling out here as to be able to provide better technology that is measurable and more transparency on their part. When I was just at RSA, there was 400 booths all claiming we have AI, we have the best AI, and that kind of drove me nuts. I have separate presentations on what's on AI and how it all works. So the best way to do it is, please, you go measure all this stuff, send me the results. Let's start publishing them. And I've only been doing this now for 2 months, and it's going to require a few people to really help out and call out the vendors. Product A works in 1 second. Product B works in 100 seconds. Which one do you want in your system? And let's start getting the pressure on them to improve their performance and how they work inside of feedback-based networks.
Thank you, Win. Now to conclude the presentation, can you please shed some light on how ISO standards, more respectively ISO 27001, is helping industries and organizations mitigate risks or cyber attacks?
Well, any set of standards is better than no set of standards, and certainly ISO has been doing it for, I got 50, 60 years in various industries. I believe that the ISO standards, as we evolve the concepts of analog security, are going to need to evolve as well. But right now, my appreciation for ISO is that they have more of a global view than just a single country's view. And I'm highly appreciative of the fact that these ISO, I can speak ISO in Australia, I can speak it in Japan, I can speak it in Europe, and I can speak it in the United States. And at least we have a common frame of reference from which to go with. It's always going to need to change over time, and I'm hoping to help influence that.
Well, thank you, Win, once again for this great and insightful presentation, and thank you everyone here for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. For more information about our upcoming or past webinars, please visit our website www.pecb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.